The reading I'd like to share with you today is a poem by Naomi Shihab Nye, and this is entitled Different Ways to Pray. There was the method of kneeling, a fine method if you lived in a country where stones were smooth. The women dreamed wistfully of bleached courtyards, hidden corners where knee fit rock. Their prayers were weathered rib bones, small calcium words uttered in sequence as if this shedding of syllables could somehow fuse them to the sky. There were the men who had been shepherds so long they walked like sheep. Under the olive trees they raised their arms. Hear us, we have pain on earth. We have so much pain, there is no place to store it. But the olives bobbed peacefully in fragrant buckets of vinegar and thyme, and at night the men ate heartily, flatbread and white cheese, and were happy in spite of the pain, because there was also happiness. Some prized the pilgrimage, wrapping themselves in new white linen to ride buses across miles of vacant sand. When they arrived at Mecca, they would circle the holy places on foot. Many times they would bend to kiss the earth and return, their lean faces housing mystery. While for certain cousins and grandmothers the pilgrimage occurred daily, lugging water from the spring or balancing the baskets of grapes, these were the ones present at births, humming quietly to perspiring mothers, the ones stitching intricate needlework into children's dresses, forgetting how easily children soil their clothes. There were those who didn't care about praying, the young ones. The ones who had been to America, they told the old ones, "You are wasting your time." Time? The old ones prayed for the young ones. They prayed for Allah to mend their brains, for the twig, the round moon, to suddenly speak in a commanding tone. And occasionally, there would be one who did none of this. The old man, Fauzi, for example, Fauzi the fool, who beat everyone at dominoes. Instead, he spoke with God as he spoke with goats, and was famous for his laugh. God is great, say the words. I bear witness that there is no God except the one God. I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. Hurry to salvation. God is great. There is no God except the one God. Today, in many, many thousands of places around the world, roughly 2 billion Muslims will roll out their prayer mat as they hear the call to prayer, and they will roll out their mat pointing it towards Mecca and kneel to say the Salat prayer. Many of them will do it the full 5 times that are required. Some will do it less, some will not at all, or perhaps, like Fauzi, will pray to their goats. The beautiful tones we just listened to will ring from towers of mosques all over the world, from Bethesda, Maryland, and New York City, to Karachi, to Cairo, to Abu Dhabi, to Jakarta. There is no count at this point of how many mosques have been bombed during this war that we're in. Certainly several in Iran are known to have been damaged in the past 2 weeks. And it is difficult At least for me, it is difficult for me to imagine what it will be like to try to celebrate the feast day of Eid al-Fitr this year. As Jill, Layla, and Mesa so beautifully shared with us, we are in the closing days of the holy month of Ramadan, and this is the most holy time, the last 10 days, when it is said that in the year 610, Muhammad, who was on retreat praying in a cave in Hira mountain not far from Mecca, first heard the voice of the angel Jibril, who we know as Gabriel, sharing with him the very first verses of the Quran. Muhammad, for the next 23 years, would travel back again and again to the cave to receive the revelation of the verses of the Quran. When I actually preached my very first sermon ever from a pulpit, it was a sermon about the Quran. And I learned so much that in the preparation for that day, so much that I had blissfully been ignorant of, nor had I even bothered to learn in the many years before I went to seminary. But one of the most beautiful things I learned is that these verses, the surahs of this holy text, are meant to be heard, not read. And that in order to experience the connection with the holy, one must listen, which is why I wanted to share with you the beautiful call to prayer that actually was recorded by the Harvard Pluralism Project. I remember the first time I ever heard that in person. I was with a seminary trip in Cairo, and it was an extraordinary trip for so many reasons. But one of the places we visited was the oldest mosque in the city of Cairo. It was a beautiful, huge building, and like many historic buildings, just a teeny bit dilapidated, nonetheless. We were welcomed with such warmth and hospitality. And we were taken into the base of the tower, and the cantor, the muezzin who was at that mosque, came in and shared it was time for the call to prayer. And he came and he stood in the middle of the floor, and as so many do, they put their hands here, and he sang to the top of the tower. And I will never forget that moment of feeling so honored to be in that place. The feast that marks the end of this holy month, as would make sense, is a feast of, feasting. For some, it is a one-day celebration. For others, it is 3 days. It is different in every country, just as Christmas or other holidays are celebrated differently in so many different places. But it usually begins with prayer at the mosque. It is a family day. It is a day of community. Folks will often wear new clothes or spiffy clothes. And then the rest of the day is a day of sharing with community. And as Jill and the girls read, of sharing generosity. Because it is not okay for any Muslim to not be able to celebrate for lack of means. In 2003, when our country invaded Iraq in what is known as the Second Iraq War, I was invited and attended a cocktail party given by some friends of ours who were and are quite affluent and also self-described Democrats and liberals. Now, I had been sober for quite a few years at that point, so the cocktail piece of it was not a huge attraction. But I do remember that the cocktails flowed freely, in spite of my lack of participation. And that wasn't the only thing that flowed. What flowed was a persistent stream of anti-Muslim comments. Most of these conversations started with a very similar comment, an opinion expressed, pardon me for sounding snarky, but I'll just say, an opinion meant to persuade me of how violent the Quran is, and clearly because the Quran is violent, this is why the people of Islam are so violent. I don't know if you have ever heard something like this, but it has been a persistent feature of how we in this country speak of Muslims. There were surahs in the Quran that they shared with me, and I wondered to myself, have you ever read the Bible? Because if you've read the Bible, there are more than 2 passages you can bring up to make a very similar comment about Christianity. So actually, I found this very interesting. I didn't know this, but actually a United States software engineer in 2016 who had really been irritated by this continuation of Islamophobic remarks, decided to create a special program which he called Odin. Odin, I don't know why the Viking god had anything to do with this, but whatever, he called it Odin, to do a quick analysis of the Bible and the Quran to see how many times topics such as death and destruction were mentioned. He divided the search into 8 categories of emotions: joy, anticipation, anger, disgust, sadness, surprise, fear, anxiety, and trust. And the winner is, ladies and gentlemen, the Old Testament, which scores twice as high in incidence of violence as the Quran. The New Testament, too, scores higher, even though not quite twice as much. And I want to be clear that Mr. Anderson is also clear that this is not the be-all and end-all of theological study, but it's an interesting piece of data. I also want to be clear, dear friends, I want to be clear that while the incidents and the comments and the hatred and the fear around the hatred and the violence and the fear of Muslims has been on a crescendo, that the largest amount of religious hate is being directed right now against our Jewish siblings. The Anti-Defamation League reported this week that anti-Semitic attacks, as we've all seen, have surged, blaming Jews for the war in Iran. You and I have come very far from the protection afforded by the First Amendment for religious freedom. The story, though, that I really want to share with you, having painted this combination of beautiful ritual and beautiful religious practice and this wash that is coming over us every day, not only of violence but of hate. The lesson I want to bring to you is a lesson from our own Unitarian Universalist history. And if nothing else, those of us who are Unitarian Universalists, we can apply and celebrate this lesson, and maybe even we can teach this lesson when the opportunity arises to do so. Because the fact of the matter is, when Unitarian began to have some seeds sprouting in Europe during the early decades and actually centuries of the Protestant Reformation, our religious ancestors did not follow the pathway of religious wars, which the Protestants and Catholics, well, there are estimates that 8 million Europeans died in those wars. during the 16th century. Instead, the far-left radicals who started Unitarianism actually, in 2 places in Europe, some of our greatest thinkers grew out of communities where Jews, Muslims, and Christians had lived together in harmony. In one instance, in Spain, for centuries. In another incidence in Transylvania, in the first and only, maybe there will be more someday, but who knows, Unitarian kingdom. Our faith came from learning from both of these, all 3 of these traditions. Learning, not being taught from above, not being taught by booming voices from places like this, but actually by living together. Michael Servetus, a name you've probably heard, and you'll hear more if you come to my class this afternoon on UU history and the state of our church. Michael Servetus is known because he was burned at the stake by John Calvin for basically saying there's really no such thing as a Trinity, and Jesus was great, but Jesus was not divine. He was much more eloquent than I am, but that was the basic point. Why did Servetus, who was a polymath, he was a physician, he was a theologian, he was one of these brilliant people who can do everything really well, Servetus was steeped in the religious texts. As I said, he was a Spaniard of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. He understood that there were different paths to the holy. According to many Muslims, we Christians or Unitarians, well, Unitarians, we're hopeless because we don't fit any mold, but Christians are not monotheistic because the belief in the Trinity, right? You got 3 gods, that's not monotheism. So Servetus, who preached this and had the courage actually to go to Geneva where Calvin was presiding, and he lost his life for this. In Transylvania, a small part of Hungary, where many thousands of Jews had fled after the Inquisition in Spain, which ended in 1492. So there was a large population of Jews who had sought refuge, political and religious refuge, in the Ottoman Empire. They had sought refuge in an Islamic kingdom. The Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg dynasty, which was Catholic, both had pretty strong claims over Hungary, and so there was a lot of conflict. But the Ottoman Empire at the time was ruled by Suleiman I, known as Suleiman the Magnificent, who was religiously liberal, who was religiously tolerant. When John Sigismund, the king, the one and only Unitarian king, decided to call or name Unitarianism as the religion of his tiny country, he had learned the lessons of religious tolerance from a Muslim Turkish emperor, sultan. He had also learned religious tolerance and religious pluralism from his mother, Isabella of Poland, who was a humanist, who did not actually believe in any God. She was highly educated. She became the regent because her husband, the father, he was an infant when the father died, so she ruled for 19 years. And her liberal views, combined with the liberal views of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and the living together of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, created not only the very first edict of religious tolerance, but created our faith. I have to tell you from a really personal point of view that this story moves me, this history moves me in a way that I can't even begin to describe. It lifts my heart that learning and being with one another, living together, figuring out problems together, and learning how to know each other is and always has been possible. And that you and I, knowing that this is who we come from, can also carry that message with pride and with that understanding. So I've talked mostly about Unitarians, and before I stop, I want to tell you one Universalist story. So the person who, long before John Murray, was preaching Universalist sermons in on the colonies of what would be the United States, was a man named George de Benneville, who was related to royalty, to British royalty. And as a young man, he became a midshipman on a British Navy boat and that went to Algiers. This is a story he writes about in his memoirs. And when they were in Algiers, a group of Algerian Muslims came on board the ship, and they were selling stuff and snacks and, whatever. And one of them fell and badly injured his leg and was just kind of writhing around on the ground. And all the other Algerians came up to him, and they began weeping over him and trying to make sure the sun was shining on his face, of the face of their wounded comrade. And de Benneville thought to himself, well, these heathens, this is disgusting. So he sent his servant, right, because he had servants, to gather this group of Algerians and to bring them to his quarters. Presumably he was going to scold them. And they explained to him, we shed our tears on our friend because we wanted the salt to help clean his wound. And we turned his face to the sun so that he would feel the warmth and it might bring him out of shock. And in that moment, de Benneville, who was kind of a mystic, actually had a religious experience. And he actually fell to his knees and said to them, you are more Christian than I am. Thank you for teaching me this lesson. I will never forget it. And in fact, he went on to be a man who also became a doctor, came to the colonies, and preached the good news of universal salvation, that a loving God will never condemn any human being to eternal damnation. Eid Mubarak. May this be a blessed and joyful Eid for all of you. Amen. Ashe, and blessed be.